A buried aircraft emerges from the icy depths of the Arctic, revealing secrets frozen in time for decades. Scientists stand at the precipice of a discovery that will challenge everything we thought we knew about the past. What they found inside that plane will send shockwaves through the scientific community and beyond. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The icy wind howled across the barren white landscape, cutting through layers of thermal gear as Dr. João Oliveira's boots crunched over the frozen ground. Each exhale created ghostly plumes that vanished into the Arctic air. He paused mid-stride, heart pounding against his ribs, as the unmistakable curve of a metallic fuselage emerged from beneath layers of blue-tinged ice. An impossible relic lost to myth, now revealed by nature's reluctant hand. "Over here!" João called, his voice nearly swallowed by the vastness surrounding them. He waved frantically, unable to tear his eyes from the discovery. The rest of the expedition team trudged through knee-deep snow, their faces registering shock as they approached. Lucia Santos reached him first, her experienced tracker's eyes narrowing as she assessed the find. The woman's gloved hand instinctively reached for her camera, documenting what no human had seen in decades. "Is it really?" Pedro Costa whispered, his breath catching. The aviation researcher had spent years studying disappearances like this one, but never expected to actually find such a prize. João nodded, unable to form words as emotion constricted his throat. The missing Lisbon flight. Ana Silva, standing slightly apart from the group, remained characteristically stoic. The boat pilot who had navigated them through treacherous waters to reach this desolate location simply stared, her weathered face betraying nothing but a flicker of reverence. João signaled for everyone to spread out. They moved with practiced efficiency, despite the electric thrill coursing through their bodies. The scientist pulled out his device, marking coordinates while stealing glances at the aircraft. Its wings stretched outward like frozen appendages, the metal skin dulled by time, but remarkably intact. "According to the records, this disappeared in 1952, Pedro said, consulting his notes with trembling hands. 67 passengers and crew. No distress call, no debris field. Just vanished between continents." Lucia knelt at the edge of the ice sheet, examining where erosion had begun revealing the fuselage. "The warming patterns must have accelerated recently," she observed. "Another year, and someone else would have found it." João carefully approached the exposed section, running his gloved fingers along the cold metal. "This is what we came for," he said quietly. "The missing flight between Lisbon and North America, whispered about for generations but never found, until now." Ana joined him, her practical nature asserting itself. "We should set up equipment before the weather turns," she advised, glancing at the darkening horizon. "Whatever secrets this plane holds have waited this long. They can wait until we're properly prepared." The team exchanged looks of determination mingled with apprehension. None voiced the question hanging in the frigid air. What exactly would they find preserved inside? The team trudged closer to the aircraft, their boots crunching through the crystalline snow. Lucia Santos, with her tracker's trained gaze, suddenly halted. Her gloved hand shot up, signaling the others to stop. "There," she whispered, pointing toward one of the frost-covered windows. Something moved inside. The rest of the expedition members squinted through the blinding white glare. A pale, shifting shadow seemed to drift past the iced-over porthole, there one moment and gone the next, like smoke dissolving into air. "Did you all see that?" Pedro asked, his voice barely audible above the whistling Arctic wind. The aviation researcher clutched his camera tighter, knuckles white beneath his thermal gloves. Dr. João Oliveira felt his pulse quicken, but years of scientific discipline steadied his resolve. "It could be ice shifting," he offered, though his tone lacked conviction, "or light playing tricks." Ana Silva, standing slightly apart from the group, shook her head. "That was no trick of light," the boat pilot muttered, her normally stoic expression betraying unease. The tension hung between them like a physical presence, thicker than the clouds of condensation forming with each exhaled breath. They exchanged glances, each face painted with the same mixture of apprehension and scientific curiosity. No one wanted to be the first to suggest retreat. "We continue," João finally decided, forcing his trembling hands to steady. "But we stay together. Document everything." He withdrew his device from an insulated pocket and began photographing the scene methodically. The others followed suit, professional training overriding their instinctive fear. The aircraft emerged from its icy tomb in fragments through their lenses, a section of warped fuselage here, the ghostly outline of ice-crusted wings there. Pedro focused on the cockpit area, zooming in on what appeared to be silhouettes frozen in eternal stillness. "The preservation is remarkable," he noted, his scientific fascination momentarily eclipsing his unease. "Uvi the Cold has essentially mummified everything." Lucia circled the perimeter, her experienced eyes scanning not just the aircraft, but their surroundings. "We should work quickly," she advised, glancing at the darkening sky. "Weather changes fast out here." Anna captured images of what looked like handprints pressed against one window from the inside. She showed the screen to João without comment, her expression grim. The scientist stared at the image, a chill running through him that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperatures. Those prints seemed recent, the frost disturbed in ways that decades of entombment couldn't explain. "We need to find a way inside," João decided, though part of him dreaded what awaited them within the frozen fuselage. "Whatever happened here, we're going to uncover the truth." The team nodded in silent agreement, each steeling themselves for what lay ahead in the Arctic's grim discovery. The team hesitated at the entrance, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Dr. João Oliveira was the first to step inside the aircraft's cabin, his flashlight beam cutting through decades of darkness. The silence that greeted them felt almost sacred, as if they had entered a forgotten cathedral of tragedy. "It's perfectly preserved," João whispered, his voice barely audible. The interior of the plane was a frozen tableau of interrupted lives. Frost coated every surface, seats, walls, and ceiling, giving the cabin an ethereal, glittering quality. Personal belongings remained exactly where their owners had left them in their final moments. A child's doll with painted rosy cheeks sat upright in seat 14C, its plastic eyes staring blankly ahead. A leather wallet lay open on the floor, its contents, photos and identification cards, visible yet untouchable beneath a thin layer of ice. Lucia Santos moved carefully down the narrow aisle, her experienced tracker's eyes missing nothing. She paused beside a jacket draped over an armrest, where a string of pearls had frozen mid-spill, each bead suspended in time like tiny moons. "These people never had a chance," she murmured, her stoic demeanor momentarily cracking. Ana Silva photographed everything methodically, the camera's flash illuminating the cabin in harsh bursts. Each image captured would later become evidence in piecing together this tragic puzzle, but for now they were simply witnesses to history. Pedro Costa, the aviation researcher, had been examining the cabin walls when his flashlight revealed something disturbing. Deep gouges ran along several seatbacks, tearing through fabric and foam. Similar marks scarred the walls near the emergency exits. "João," he called, his voice trembling with unease. The scientist approached, frowning at the discovery. Pedro ran his gloved fingers along the grooves. "These are claw marks," he said, pointing to a particularly deep set. "And look at these, they're different from the others. No frost formation inside the gouges." He looked up at his colleague, face pale in the harsh light. "Alguma coisa esteve aqui recentemente," he whispered in Portuguese, the familiar language a comfort in this alien place. The words sank into João's mind like a warning. Something was here recently. The team leader studied the marks more closely. They were unmistakably made by something large and powerful, something that had managed to enter and exit the sealed aircraft. We need to document everything and move quickly, Juon decided, his scientific curiosity battling with a growing sense of unease. Whatever made these marks might return. The four scientists exchanged nervous glances, suddenly aware that they might not be alone in this frozen tomb. Ana Silva maintained her position near the aircraft's hatch, her stoic demeanor a stark contrast to the unease gripping the team. The boat pilot had seen her share of strange occurrences during Arctic expeditions, but something about this frozen time capsule felt different. She raised her camera, methodically documenting the exterior of the wreckage when something caught her eye through the viewfinder. "And look at this!" she called out, her voice cutting through the whistling Arctic wind. The three scientists huddled around her as she displayed the screen of her device. There, just beyond the tail section of the aircraft, stood a distinct white form, tall, almost human-like, but somehow wrong in its proportions. "I didn't see anything when I took this," Ana whispered, her usually calm expression now troubled. "None of us did." João Oliveira studied the image intently, his scientific mind racing through possibilities. "Could be a reflection or lens flare," he suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Pedro shook his head. "That's no camera artifact," the aviation researcher insisted, zooming in on the image. "Look at how it casts a shadow on the snow." Lucia's reaction was immediate and visceral. The experienced tracker's body language transformed, shoulders tensing as she scanned their surroundings. Years of survival instinct kicked in as she motioned for everyone to move closer together. "Something's out there," she murmured, her sharp eyes darting between the ice formations surrounding them. "And it's watching us." The wind seemed to grow colder as the realization settled over the team. They had ventured into one of Earth's most unforgiving environments to study the dead, only to discover they might not be alone among the living. "We should get back inside," Ana suggested, her hand instinctively reaching for the flare gun at her belt. The boat pilot had navigated treacherous waters her entire career, but this frozen graveyard presented dangers she couldn't chart. João nodded in agreement. "Stay together. No one wanders off alone," he instructed, assuming the leadership role that had become second nature during their expeditions. As they retreated toward the aircraft's entrance, Lucia lingered behind, studying the pristine snow around them. The tracker knelt down, her gloved fingers hovering over what appeared to be a slight depression in the powder. "Tracks," she whispered, almost to herself, "but not human, and not like any Arctic animal I recognize." The team huddled closer, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The discovery that had begun as a scientific triumph was rapidly evolving into something none of them had prepared for. Whatever lurked beyond the tail of the plane, whether natural or something else entirely, had just transformed their mission from archaeological to survival. The team ventured deeper into the aircraft's frozen interior, the beams of their flashlights cutting through decades of darkness. Dr. João Oliveira led the way, his scientific mind struggling to process the macabre tableau before them. The cabin had become a tomb of ice, preserving its occupants in a moment of terror that time had failed to erase. "My God," João whispered, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The passengers remained in their seats, frozen in their final moments. Some appeared peaceful, as if sleep had taken them before the cold. Others wore expressions of pure horror, faces contorted in silent screams that would never reach the surface world. Lucia Santos moved cautiously between the rows, her experienced tracker's eyes missing nothing. "The preservation is remarkable," she noted, her usual stoicism wavering slightly. "The cold has essentially mummified them." She gestured toward a woman clutching a child to her chest, both encased in a thin layer of crystalline frost that sparkled under their lights. Pedro Costa documented everything with trembling hands, his camera clicking softly in the silence. Each photograph was both scientific evidence and a memorial to those lost. The aviation researcher couldn't help but think of his brother, vanished in another aircraft years ago. Would he have looked like this, preserved and waiting to be found? The clothing styles match the era, Anna observed, examining a man in a tailored suit, his tie still perfectly knotted. The boat pilot's practical nature helped ground the team as they faced the grim reality of their discovery. "Look at the quality of the fabrics. These were wealthy travelers." Joan's stomach twisted as he approached the front of the cabin. A flight attendant stood frozen in the aisle, her uniform dusted with ice crystals, a serving tray still balanced in her rigid hands. Her face bore an expression of dignified resignation, as if she'd known what was coming, but had maintained her composure until the end. The scientist pressed a gloved hand against his chest, feeling the weight of tragedy bearing down on him. These weren't just specimens or data points. They were people with lives, dreams, and families who had spent decades wondering about their fate. "We need to document everything," Joan said, his voice steadier than he felt. "These people deserve to have their story told." He moved methodically through the cabin, examining each face, each frozen tableau with respect and scientific precision. His resolve hardened with each step. Whatever had happened here, whatever force had brought this aircraft down and trapped its passengers in this icy prison, he would uncover the truth. He owed them that much, no matter the emotional toll it would take on him and his team. The cockpit of the frozen aircraft was a tomb of ice and machinery. Dr. João Oliveira's breath fogged in front of his face as he carefully maneuvered between the pilot and co-pilot seats, now frozen thrones encased in crystalline frost. His gloved fingers trembled, not just from the cold, but from the weight of discovery as they brushed against something embedded in the control panel. "I found it," he called out, voice barely containing his excitement. The black box. The flight recorder, aviation's most precious treasure, lay before him, entombed in a solid block of ice. Decades of Arctic temperatures had sealed it away, preserving whatever secrets it held about the final moments of the ill-fated journey between Lisbon and North America. Ana Silva pushed forward, her stoic demeanor momentarily broken by a flash of reverence in her eyes. "We need to extract it carefully," the pilot advised, her professional experience evident in her measured tone. "The data inside could deteriorate if we're not cautious." Pedro knelt beside them, pulling specialized tools from his pack. The aviation researcher's hands moved with practiced precision despite the numbing cold. "The ice actually protected it all these years," he explained, carefully chipping away at the frozen prison, like nature's own preservation system. The three worked in tense silence, their breath creating ghostly clouds in the frigid air. Ana held her flashlight steady, while Pedro and João took turns delicately freeing the device. Their gloved fingers grew increasingly clumsy as the biting cold penetrated the fabric, but none complained. This moment represented everything they had come for: answers, history, truth. Outside, Lucia Santos completed her security sweep around the perimeter of the aircraft. The experienced tracker moved with natural caution, her sharp eyes constantly scanning the white landscape. Something caught her attention near the starboard wing, indentations in the otherwise pristine snow. Crouching down, she examined them closely. These weren't the scattered footprints of their own team. These tracks were massive, with distinct claw marks at the tips, pressed deep into the powder. Most disturbing of all, they looked fresh, made within hours, not days. Lucia's heart quickened as she followed the trail with her eyes. The massive paw prints led away from the plane toward a dark outcropping of rocks in the distance. Whatever had made these tracks was large, predatory, and still in the vicinity. She reached for her radio, keeping her voice low and controlled, despite the adrenaline now coursing through her veins. "João, we have company out here. Something big has been circling the aircraft." She paused, studying the horizon, and judging by these tracks, it's still nearby. Lucia Santos raised her hand, signaling for the team to stop. Her voice barely carried over the howling Arctic wind as she called out to the others. "These tracks are fresh," she said in Portuguese, kneeling to trace the outline with her gloved finger. The impressions in the snow were enormous, with distinctive claw marks at the tips that sent a chill down her spine. Dr. João Oliveira, rushed to her side, his scientific curiosity momentarily overriding caution. The experienced tracker pointed to the depth of the prints and the clear definition. Whatever had made them had passed through recently, perhaps within the hour. The wind would have erased them otherwise. How big would you estimate? João asked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Lucia measured the print with her hand, spreading her fingers wide. At least 30 centimeters across. And look at the spacing. This creature has an enormous stride. Pedro Costa approached more hesitantly, his mind racing through the catalogue of Arctic wildlife he'd studied during their expedition preparations. The aviation researcher's face paled as he connected the evidence before them with the only logical conclusion. Polar bear, he murmured, the Portuguese words hanging heavy in the air as dread settled over the group. Ana Silva instinctively reached for her camera, documenting the tracks while scanning the horizon. The stoic boat pilot had navigated treacherous waters to bring them here, but this danger was beyond her expertise. "Should we return to the aircraft?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. João considered their options, feeling the weight of responsibility for his team's safety. The black box they'd discovered was still partially embedded in ice inside the plane. They couldn't leave without it, but the presence of an apex predator complicated everything. "We stay together," he decided firmly. "No one wanders alone, not even for a minute." Lucia nodded in agreement, her tracker's instincts on high alert. She pointed to where the massive paw prints led, toward the same rocky outcrop they'd noticed earlier. "The bear might be denning there," she suggested, her experience in the wilderness lending authority to her words. Pedro shivered, and not just from the cold. The haunting diary they'd found in the plane had mentioned something stalking the survivors. He'd assumed it was delirium from the cold, but now... "We need to work quickly," João said, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Let's get what we came for and leave before our large friend returns." The four scientists huddled closer together, their backs to the wind, eyes constantly scanning the endless white landscape. The discovery of the aircraft had been exhilarating, but now the Arctic had revealed another of its secrets. They were not alone on this frozen plain. The team huddled together in the shadow of the aircraft, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Dr. João Oliveira paced back and forth, his scientific mind calculating risks against potential discoveries. The enormous tracks in the snow led directly to a dark opening at the base of a nearby rock formation, a cave that might hold answers or dangers they couldn't imagine. "We need to follow those tracks," Pedro Costa insisted, his voice betraying both excitement and apprehension. The aviation researcher had spent years studying disappearances like this one. To turn back now would haunt him forever. Lucia Santos shook her head firmly. Too dangerous. Whatever made those prints is still out there. The experienced tracker's hand rested instinctively on her knife. "We should secure the black box and return to base camp before the weather turns." Ana Silva remained silent, her stoic gaze shifting between the cave and the frozen aircraft. Finally, she spoke. "In the diary mentioned others trying to find shelter. What if some of them made it to that cave?" The wind picked up, whistling through the wreckage behind them. João felt the weight of leadership pressing down on his shoulders. 4 lives depended on his decision. His scientific curiosity pulled him toward the cave, toward answers that might change aviation history forever. Yet responsibility tugged in the opposite direction. What good were discoveries if they never made it home to share them? "The light's fading," Lucia reminded them, gesturing at the darkening sky. "If we go, we need to move now." Pedro nodded eagerly. "We came all this way. We can't leave without knowing." João studied the tracks once more. They were fresh, but not immediate. Perhaps from earlier that day, the creature had retreated to the cave, likely for shelter. If they moved carefully, stayed together, "We'll go to the cave," he decided finally, pointing toward the dark opening where the massive paw prints disappeared into shadow. "But we stay together. No one separates from the group, not even for a moment." He distributed the emergency flares from his pack, handing one to each team member. If anything happens, signal immediately. The 4 scientists moved across the snow in tight formation, following the enormous tracks. Each step brought them closer to the cave mouth, a black void against the white landscape. Jaume led the way, flashlight cutting through the growing darkness, his mind racing with possibilities of what they might find inside: survivors, artifacts, or perhaps the creature that had been watching them all along. The cave welcomed them with unexpected warmth after hours in the biting Arctic cold. Jaume Oliveira led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through darkness that seemed almost alive with secrets. Unlike the sterile preservation of the aircraft, this place smelled of earth, time, and something distinctly animal, a musky scent that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. "Look at this," Lucia whispered, directing her light toward a shallow depression in the ground. The remains of a fire pit came into focus, blackened stones arranged in a careful circle. Around it, scraps of what once might have been clothing lay half buried in dirt and small animal droppings. Pedro Costa knelt beside the pit, running his gloved fingers through the ancient ash. "Someone survived the crash," he said, voice tight with emotion. The aviation researcher couldn't help but think of his brother, wondering if he too might have fought for survival after his own plane went down years ago. "Over here!" Anna called from several feet away. The boat pilot's stoic demeanor had cracked slightly, replaced by wonder as she illuminated a battered metal canteen. She turned it over carefully, revealing a faded airline logo that matched the one on the aircraft they'd just explored. "This proves they made it here," Jaume said, his scientific mind already calculating distances and survival possibilities. But for how long? The team spread out within the confines of the cave, careful to document everything with Anna's camera. Lucia kept one eye on the cave entrance, her tracker's instincts never fully at rest despite the apparent absence of immediate danger. In a shadowy corner, partially covered by loose stones, Anna discovered a leather satchel. Time had not been kind to it. The leather was cracked and stiff, hardened by decades of freeze-thaw cycles. With careful hands, she worked the ancient clasp open. "I found something," she announced, her typically calm voice tinged with reverence. The others gathered around as she gently extracted a leather-bound diary. Its pages had fused together at the edges, but the center remained remarkably intact, protected by the quality of the binding and the dry conditions of the cave. "Someone survived for at least some time," Anna whispered, carefully turning pages filled with increasingly desperate handwriting. The words spoke of cold, hunger, and fading hope, but also of determination and the human will to live. Jaume placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the weight of what they'd discovered. These weren't just historical artifacts. They were the final testament of people who had fought against impossible odds. "We need to preserve this," he said firmly. "These people deserve to have their story told." Pedro nodded, his eyes fixed on the diary. "They waited for rescue that never came," he said softly. "All this time, they were here, waiting." Pedro Costa's voice echoed through the dimly lit cave as he carefully turned the brittle pages of the diary. The team huddled closer, their breath visible in the cold air, despite the relative warmth of their shelter compared to the Arctic wasteland outside. "The cold is unbearable," Pedro translated, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced the faded handwriting. "Some of us tried to leave, but the storms forced us back. We still have hope." The aviation researcher paused, swallowing hard. Jaume noticed how Pedro's eyes glistened in the flashlight's beam. This discovery touched something personal in him, perhaps memories of his brother's own aviation tragedy. "They survived the crash," Anna whispered, her normally stoic expression softening with reverence for the lost. She reached out to touch the leather-bound journal, as if making physical contact with this artifact might somehow connect her to those who had written it decades ago. Lucia Santos kept one eye on the cave entrance, ever vigilant, but even she couldn't help being drawn into the human drama unfolding through the diary's pages. "For how long?" she asked, her tracker's instincts making her calculate survival odds automatically. Pedro turned another page, revealing more entries. "At least 9 days after the crash," he answered. His voice hushed with respect. "They rationed food from the plane, melted ice for water. The writer mentions 15 survivors initially, but then he didn't need to finish. They all understood the grim mathematics of Arctic survival." João Oliveira closed his eyes momentarily, imagining these passengers huddled together in this very cave. Mothers comforting children, strangers becoming family through shared ordeal, hope dwindling with each sunset. The scientist in him catalogued facts, but the human in him felt their desperation across time. They knew where they were, Pedro continued, pointing to crude maps sketched in the margins. They just couldn't make it out. The storms were too severe. The team fell into respectful silence, each lost in private thoughts. Anna's fingers absently traced the airline logo on the battered canteen they'd found earlier. Lucia gazed toward the cave entrance, perhaps seeing herself in their place, calculating what she would have done differently. Pedro turned pages with increasing urgency, searching for answers, for closure. João finally broke the silence. "We need to document everything," he said softly, his scientific purpose returning. "These people deserve to have their story told." As they carefully photographed each page of the diary, the weight of responsibility settled over them. They were no longer just scientists making a discovery. They had become custodians of memory, witnesses to a tragedy time had nearly erased. Outside, the Arctic wind howled a mournful tribute to those who had fought so hard to survive in this unforgiving landscape. A deep, guttural growl reverberated through the cave, stopping the scientists in their tracks. The sound seemed to emanate from the darkness beyond their flashlight beams, primal and unmistakable. João Oliveira felt his blood freeze, his scientific mind immediately recognizing the threat before his eyes confirmed it. "Don't move," he whispered, his breath visible in the cold air. Lucia Santos, ever the quick-thinking tracker, reached for her emergency flare with deliberate slowness. With one fluid motion, she struck it against the cave wall. Crimson light exploded through the cavern, illuminating what they had all feared but couldn't see. There, not 20 feet away, stood a massive female polar bear. Her white fur, streaked with mud, and what looked disturbingly like dried blood, bristled as she rose to her full height. Behind her, 2 small cubs huddled together, their dark eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and fear. The mother's powerful muscles tensed beneath her thick coat, ready to defend her young at any cost. "Meu Deus," Pedro whispered, his voice barely audible even in the silence of the cave. The bear's black eyes, like polished obsidian, locked onto the intruders. Her lips curled back to reveal yellowed teeth, each capable of crushing bone with frightening ease. The message in her stance was unmistakable. They had wandered into her domain, and she would protect it with lethal force if necessary. Ana Silva remained perfectly still, her stoic demeanor cracking only slightly as she gripped her camera without raising it. The boat pilot had navigated treacherous waters all her life, but nothing had prepared her for facing an apex predator in its den. The scientists stood frozen, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Each breath seemed deafening in the tense silence. João could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold, his mind racing through survival protocols. This magnificent creature, this force of nature, was the shadow they had glimpsed earlier, not a ghost, but something far more dangerous and real. The cubs whimpered, pressing closer to their mother. One made a tentative move forward, but the female bear growled again, nudging it back with her massive head. The protective instinct radiating from her was palpable, a universal language that transcended species. Time stretched like elastic as human, and bear regarded each other. In that moment, João understood with perfect clarity. They were the intruders here. This was her territory, claimed through the ancient right of survival in this unforgiving landscape. The diary, the plane, the mysteries they sought, All of it suddenly seemed secondary to the primal truth before them. Dr. Juan Oliveira raised his hand slowly, signaling the team to retreat. His eyes never left the massive polar bear whose hot breath condensed in the frigid air of the cave. He gestured with subtle movements, knowing that any sudden action could trigger the mother's protective instinct. "Uga back away, slowly," João whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't turn around." Lucia Santos inched backward first, her experienced tracker's instincts keeping her movements fluid and non-threatening. The bear's black eyes tracked them. Intelligent and wary, her massive paws planted firmly before her cubs. This magnificent predator, this guardian of the Arctic, was undoubtedly the shadow they had glimpsed near the aircraft, the presence that had left those enormous tracks in the snow. Pedro Costa's hand trembled slightly as he maintained his position between Ana and the bear. The aviation researcher had faced many challenges in his career, but nothing that stirred such primal fear. The bear huffed, a warning rumble deep in her chest that echoed off the cave walls. "She won't attack unless we provoke her," Lucia breathed, her expertise in wildlife evident in her calm assessment. "She's just protecting her young." Step by agonizing step, the scientists retreated toward the cave entrance, where daylight cast long blue shadows across the snow. Ana Silva kept her composure, though her knuckles had turned white around her flashlight. The stoic boat pilot had navigated treacherous waters before, but this confrontation with raw nature struck a deeper chord of respect and terror. When they finally emerged into the open air, the team collapsed into the snow, legs giving way as adrenaline surged through their systems. João fell to his knees, gulping the clean, cold air, his heart hammering against his ribs. "That was her all along," Ana said between deep breaths. "The shadow in my photographs." Pedro nodded, running a shaking hand through his frost-dusted hair. "Not a ghost or survivor after all, just nature reclaiming what we've intruded upon." The revelation shifted something fundamental in their understanding of the expedition. The mystery they had come to solve wasn't just about the dead passengers frozen in time aboard the aircraft. It was about life persisting in the harshest conditions imaginable, the bear family carving out existence in this unforgiving landscape, using the human tragedy as shelter. "The line between us and them," João murmured, gazing back at the dark mouth of the cave, "is thinner than we think." Lucia pulled herself to her feet, brushing snow from her thermal gear. "We need to respect that line. This is her territory now." The team gathered themselves, the weight of their discovery settling on their shoulders. The frozen aircraft held secrets of human loss, but the cave had revealed something equally profound, the resilience of life itself, wild and untamed, continuing long after human stories had ended. Back at their makeshift camp, the team huddled around the small heater that barely pushed back the Arctic chill. Pedro Costa's fingers, though protected by 2 layers of gloves, had lost most feeling as he meticulously worked on the black box. The aviation researcher had been trained for this, but never in such extreme conditions. Every movement was deliberate, every tool handled with excruciating care. "How much longer?" Ana asked, her stoic expression betraying a hint of concern as she handed him a steaming cup of coffee. "Hours, maybe," Pedro replied, his breath visible in the frigid air. "The circuitry is incredibly fragile. One wrong move, and we lose everything." Lucia Santos kept watch near the entrance of their tent, her experienced eyes scanning the white horizon. The tracker had insisted on maintaining a rotation of lookouts after their encounter with the polar bear. "That creature has been watching us since we arrived," she muttered, adjusting her thermal hood. Dr. Juan Oliveira sat cross-legged on his sleeping bag, documenting their findings in his waterproof journal. The scientist couldn't shake the image of the massive bear from his mind. If she had survived here for years, perhaps even generations of her family had made this frozen wasteland their home, what other secrets might this desolate landscape be protecting? "The bear wasn't afraid of us," João said suddenly, breaking the silence. Almost as if she's encountered humans before." Ana looked up from her device, where she was reviewing the photographs she'd taken. Maybe from the plane survivors. Impossible, Pedro interjected without looking up from his delicate work. That would be decades ago. Bears don't live that long. But their descendants might, Lucia countered. Knowledge passes through generations. My grandfather taught me to track before I could read. Outside, the wind howled across the ice field, a mournful sound that seemed to carry whispers from the past. Joanne's mind raced with possibilities. What if some passengers had survived the initial crash? What if they had established some kind of existence here, however brief? The diary they'd found suggested as much. There's something we're missing, the scientist said, his determination renewed despite the exhaustion etched on his face. Something connecting the crash, the missing passengers, and this place. Pedro's exclamation cut through Joanne's thoughts. Got it! The outer casing is free. A small victory, but significant. The black box, actually orange in color, now lay partially exposed from its icy prison. As night descended over the Arctic landscape, turning the world into endless shadow, Joanne stepped outside the tent. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he needed to clear his head. Above him, the stars shone with brutal clarity. The same stars that had witnessed whatever tragedy befell that aircraft decades ago. Whatever secrets this frozen land was guarding, he was determined to uncover them all. The team huddled around the device as the black box data began to transfer. Dr. João Oliveira's eyes remained fixed on the screen, his breath creating small clouds in the frigid air of their camp. The upload bar crawled forward at an agonizing pace, each percentage point a small victory against the harsh conditions. It's working, Pedro whispered, his voice tight with anticipation. The aviation researcher had been working tirelessly for hours, carefully thawing the flight recorder without damaging its precious contents. When the data finally appeared, the cabin fell silent. The cockpit recordings painted a terrifying picture of the final moments aboard the lost flight. The pilots, voices preserved across decades, filled their shelter with ghosts. Severe turbulence, instruments malfunctioning, came the captain's voice, tense but controlled. Then another. What is that light? It's not on any charts. João leaned forward, his scientific mind racing to make sense of the readings. The flight had encountered a massive storm system, but the meteorological data showed something else, a strange atmospheric anomaly that didn't match any known weather patterns from that era. Look at this, Anna said, pointing to a visualization of the flight path. The stoic boat pilot rarely showed emotion, but her finger trembled slightly as she traced the aircraft's final trajectory. They diverted nearly 90 degrees from their planned route. The recording continued, revealing increasing panic as the instrument spun wildly, altitude dropping precipitously. The co-pilot could be heard praying in Portuguese while alarms blared in the background. Something pulled them off course, Pedro said, his face pale. The researcher knew all too well the horror of losing loved ones to the sky. His brother's disappearance in a similar accident had driven his career choice. The final minutes were punctuated by static and terrified voices calling for help. Then, abruptly, silence. No impact sounds, no final words, just an unnatural void that sent chills through everyone present. Lucia, who had been standing guard near the entrance, moved closer. What could cause that? She asked, her tracker's instinct sensing danger even in decades-old recordings. Joanne's mind raced through possibilities, magnetic anomalies, equipment failure, pilot error, but none fully explained the bizarre flight pattern or the sudden silence. Something had drawn the aircraft to this specific location, like a moth to flame. Whatever happened, he said finally, it wasn't just bad luck or weather. This plane was guided here. He looked up at his team, the weight of this realization heavy in his eyes, and we need to find out why. Outside, the Arctic wind howled, as if warning them against uncovering secrets long buried beneath the ice. Back at the expedition camp, Lucia Santos hunched over the passenger manifest she'd recovered from the aircraft. meticulously cross-referencing it with their documentation of the bodies found inside the wreckage. The tracker's methodical nature served her well as she worked through the list, matching names to the photographs and notes they had compiled. "João," she called, her voice tight with concern. "Come look at this." Dr. João Oliveira abandoned his analysis of ice core samples and joined her at the makeshift table. The scientist's expression grew grave as Lucia pointed to 5 names on the manifest, each circled in red. 5 passengers, she explained, with no corresponding bodies in the wreckage. "I've checked 3 times. Pedro Costa looked up from his work with the black box data, his eyes widening. The aviation researcher had seen enough crash investigations to know what this meant. They could have been thrown from the aircraft during impact, he suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "Or they survived the initial crash," João murmured, the implications hanging heavy in the frigid air. Ana Silva, who had been organizing her photographic documentation on her device, suddenly straightened. "I need to show you something," the boat pilot said, her usually stoic demeanor betraying a hint of unease. She pulled up a series of images taken during their exploration and zoomed in on one particular frame. The team gathered around, breaths held collectively as they studied what appeared to be a figure standing at the periphery of one shot, partially obscured by swirling snow. "I didn't notice it when I took the picture," Anna explained, her finger tracing the outline on the screen. "But look, that's clearly a passenger coat, tattered, weathered, but unmistakably from the same era as the crash." João enlarged the image, his scientific mind racing. The coat hung from what seemed to be a human form, positioned near the cave entrance where they had encountered the polar bear family. "Could someone have actually survived out here?" Pedro whispered, thinking of his own lost brother, imagining him stranded in some similar wilderness. Lucia shook her head skeptically. "For decades. Impossible." "But what if they survived for weeks? Months, even?" João countered, recalling the diary entries they'd found. The cave provided shelter, and clearly the area sustained the bear family. Anna scrolled to another image, the collapsed shelter they'd discovered. The diary mentioned others trying to find help. What if these 5 attempted to reach civilization? The team fell silent, contemplating the desperate scenario, survivors trudging through endless white, hope fading with each step, the Arctic claiming them one by one. "Tomorrow," João decided, "we search for more evidence. If anyone survived even temporarily, they might have left other traces." The mystery of the 5 missing passengers haunted their dreams that night, ghosts wandering through the endless white. 3 weeks into their Arctic expedition, the psychological strain began to take its toll. The team's once comfortable research camp now felt like a prison of ice and shadow. Every creak of the tent fabric in the wind made them jump. Every distant howl raised the hair on their necks. Sleep came in fitful bursts, haunted by dreams of frozen faces and black eyes watching from the darkness. Dr. João Oliveira noticed the changes in his colleagues. Pedro Costa had taken to muttering to himself while reviewing the black box data, his fingers trembling as he rewound the same terrifying final moments of the flight over and over. Ana Silva, normally stoic, had grown unnaturally quiet, her camera remaining untouched for days after she'd discovered strange blurs in her photographs that resembled human figures where none should have been. "We need to discuss our timeline," João announced one morning over lukewarm coffee. "The university expects preliminary findings within 10 days. Lucia Santos looked up sharply. "Preliminary findings. We have more than enough. We should pack up and leave before something worse happens." Her voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. The experienced tracker had taken to sleeping with her knife beside her pillow. "There are still 5 missing passengers, unaccounted for," João countered, spreading the manifest across their makeshift table. "And we've barely scratched the surface of understanding how that aircraft ended up here." "Those passengers have been missing for decades," Lucia hissed, her haunted eyes reflecting the lantern light. "They're not missing anymore. They're dead." Just like we'll be if we stay. The tension in the tent thickened. Anna and Pedro exchanged uncomfortable glances as the two senior team members squared off. We have a responsibility to science, to history, João insisted, though doubt clouded his features. Each night, the weight of leadership pressed heavier on his shoulders. The faces of the frozen dead visited him in dreams, silently pleading for recognition, for the dignity of having their story told. We have a responsibility to stay alive, Lucia shot back. She pointed toward the cave where they'd encountered the bear. That animal isn't the only danger here. Something about this place isn't right. You feel it too. I know you do. João rubbed his temples, torn between the pull of discovery and the push of survival instinct. The expedition that had begun with such promise now balanced on a knife's edge. Every choice he made carried consequences he couldn't fully predict, and the lives of his team hung in the balance. 3 more days, he finally said, a compromise that satisfied no one. Then we reassess. The team nodded silently, each member already counting the hours until they could leave this frozen graveyard behind. The Arctic night pressed against the thin walls of their shelter as Pedro Costa stared at the ceiling, his mind refusing to surrender to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, memories of Miguel flooded back, his younger brother's excited face before boarding that fateful flight to Manaus 8 years ago. A flight that vanished over the Amazon, leaving nothing but questions. This is different, Pedro whispered to himself, clutching the leather-bound diary they'd recovered. This time, we can find answers. The aviation researcher pulled himself from his sleeping bag and moved to the small table where the expedition's equipment hummed softly. The black box data glowed on his screen, altitude readings, distress signals, final communications, all pieces of a puzzle he desperately needed to solve, not just for the nameless passengers frozen in time, but for Miguel too. You should sleep, came Anna's quiet voice from the darkness. The boat pilot sat up, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light of the monitors. I can't, Pedro replied, his fingers tracing the brittle pages of the diary. Something's here. Something we're missing. Anna moved beside him, her steady presence a comfort in the howling emptiness outside. She had noticed how this mission affected him differently than the others, how his hands trembled when they first entered the aircraft, how he lingered over the personal effects. Your brother? She asked simply. Pedro nodded. If someone had found Miguel's plane, if someone had tried this hard, his voice trailed off. For hours, they worked together in near silence, Anna helping him cross-reference the diary entries with the flight data. The survivor's handwriting grew increasingly erratic with each page, desperation seeping through the faded ink. Near dawn, Pedro's exhausted eyes caught something, a pattern in the seemingly random markings along the diary's margins. Not random at all, but coordinates, disguised as doodles. Look at this, he said, suddenly energized. These marks, they're a code, latitude and longitude, written to look like nothing important. Anna leaned closer, her eyes widening. Your final journey, 5 survivors, Pedro whispered, connecting the dots. They waited for rescue, then tried to save themselves. They headed north. When Dr. João Oliveira entered the shelter hours later, he found Pedro transformed, the haunted look replaced by determined focus. The researcher spread maps across the table, plotting points with precision. I know where they went, Pedro announced, looking up at João with newfound purpose. And why no search ever found them? Lucia Santos joined them, skepticism written across her face. Another wild chase? No, Pedro answered firmly. A chance for closure, for them, and for me. The morning broke with an eerie calm as Dr. João Oliveira gathered his team for one final expedition. The coded message from the diary had ignited a spark of determination in his weary eyes. This might be our last chance to find what happened to those 5 missing passengers, he said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Lucia checked their supplies meticulously, her experienced hands moving with practiced efficiency. "We have 6 hours of daylight at most," she warned, glancing at the horizon where storm clouds threatened to gather. The tracker had opposed this final venture, but her loyalty to the team outweighed her misgivings. They trudged northward, following the bearing indicated in the diary's cryptic final pages. Pedro walked silently beside Anna, both lost in thought about what they might discover. The aviation researcher had barely slept, the parallels to his brother's disappearance weighing heavily on his mind. After 3 hours of grueling travel across the unforgiving terrain, Anna spotted something unnatural among the pristine white landscape. "There!" she called out, pointing toward a dark shape partially buried in snow. As they approached, the structure revealed itself, a collapsed shelter cobbled together from driftwood and animal furs. João fell to his knees, carefully brushing away decades of accumulated ice and snow. The shelter spoke of desperate ingenuity, of humans fighting against impossible odds. "They made it this far," Pedro whispered, voice thick with emotion. "At least some of them survived the crash." Lucia circled the perimeter, her sharp eyes scanning for signs of danger or further clues. "The construction is clever," she noted. "They used techniques that would have protected them from the wind." João's gloved hands worked methodically through the remnants. Beneath a rotted section of fur, something metallic caught the pale Arctic light. He extracted it carefully. A medallion, its surface corroded by time, but still bearing a name etched into the metal. "Maria Cardoso," he read aloud, his voice breaking. She's one of the 5 missing from the manifest." Anna photographed everything with reverent precision, documenting this final chapter of a decades-old tragedy. The team stood in silence, the weight of discovery settling over them like the endless Arctic sky. Their victory felt hollow. They had answers now, but not the ones they'd hoped for. No miraculous survival, no happy ending, just the stark reality of human fragility against nature's power. "They tried," Pedro said finally, holding the medallion in his palm. "They fought until the very end." João nodded, surveying the vast emptiness surrounding them. "The Arctic gives up its secrets reluctantly," he said, "and even then, never completely." As they prepared to return to camp, each carried a piece of the story with them, a story of courage, desperation, and the unforgiving truth that some mysteries remain forever half-solved. Dr. João Oliveira stood motionless before the ice-encrusted wreckage, his breath forming clouds that danced with the swirling snow around him. The expedition was ending, their equipment already packed and waiting at camp. Yet he couldn't leave without this final moment of reflection, this silent farewell to the souls whose story they had uncovered. "It's time," Lucia said softly, approaching from behind. The tracker's normally vigilant expression had softened, understanding the weight of this moment for her colleague. João nodded without turning. "They waited decades to be found," he murmured. "I just need 1 more minute." The scientist closed his eyes, feeling the Arctic wind against his face. In the weeks they had spent here, this desolate landscape had transformed from an alien world into something deeply personal. The passengers of the doomed flight, their possessions, their final moments, all had become etched into his consciousness. "We did right by them," Anna said, joining them with Pedro. The boat pilot's stoic demeanor had cracked slightly, revealing the emotion beneath. "Their families will finally have answers." Pedro clutched the medallion they had discovered at the collapsed shelter, now carefully preserved in a specimen bag. "Not just answers," the aviation researcher added, his voice thick. "Closure. Something I never had with my brother." The team stood together in silence, united by their shared experience. They had come seeking scientific discovery, but found something far more profound, a story of human endurance, of desperate hope in the face of overwhelming odds. A movement on the horizon caught Lucia's attention. "Look," she whispered, pointing toward a distant ridge. There, silhouetted against the pale Arctic sky, stood the female polar bear with her cubs. The massive creature paused, seeming to regard the humans from afar, before disappearing over the ridge with her family. "Perfect timing," João said with a sad smile. Our true discovery wasn't the wreckage at all. Anna nodded. It was life persisting where it shouldn't be possible. The bear and her cubs had become the expedition's most powerful symbol, not the ghostly presence they had initially feared, but a testament to resilience and survival. In this harshest of realms, where humans had perished despite their technology, this family had thrived for generations. As they turned to leave, João took one final photograph of the site. The world would remember their scientific breakthrough, the headlines would celebrate the discovery, but he knew he would always carry something else. The ghosts of this place, the whispers of the lost, and the profound lesson of the Arctic's indifferent power. 3 months after their return to Brazil, the discovery of the frozen aircraft continued to captivate the world. Major news outlets from São Paulo to New York featured the haunting images of the preserved wreckage. Dr. João Oliveira found himself thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight, his phone constantly ringing with interview requests from international media outlets eager to hear first-hand accounts of what the team had discovered beneath the Arctic ice. The University of São Paulo hosted a special exhibition showcasing artifacts recovered from the site. Behind glass displays, visitors gazed at the leather wallet, the child's doll, and the string of pearls, silent witnesses to lives abruptly halted decades ago. Airlines commissioned extensive studies of the black box data, hoping to prevent similar tragedies by understanding what had lured the aircraft so dramatically off course. Pedro Costa threw himself into analyzing the flight recordings, working late nights in his laboratory. The aviation researcher found purpose in this work, the lost passengers becoming surrogates for his own brother, who had vanished years before. Each piece of data brings us closer to understanding what happened, he told João during their weekly meetings, his eyes reflecting both pain and determination. Lucia Santos had already departed for another expedition, but she called regularly to check on her former teammates. The experienced tracker seemed relieved to be away from the memories of those massive paw prints in the snow, though she admitted to João that she sometimes dreamed of the bear and her cubs. Ana Silva compiled their photographs into a comprehensive digital archive. The boat pilot worked meticulously, cataloguing each image with scientific precision while treating the visual record with the reverence it deserved. Her photograph of the ghostly figure near the cave had become the most analyzed image from their expedition, spawning countless theories online. One evening, alone in his apartment overlooking the bustling streets of São Paulo, João stood on his balcony, clutching the medallion they had found beneath the collapsed shelter. The weight of it in his palm transported him instantly back to the vast white silence of the Arctic. He could almost feel the biting cold, hear the howling wind, and see the piercing gaze of the polar bear, standing protectively over her young. In that moment, João understood that while the world celebrated their discovery, the true impact of their journey lay in what couldn't be displayed in museums or analyzed in laboratories. The Arctic had taught them humility in the face of nature's raw power, respect for its ancient secrets, and gratitude for its occasional mercy. These were the lessons he would carry forever, long after the headlines faded and the world moved on to new wonders and mysteries.